The rider came out of the heat like something the desert had decided to spit back out, and Jedediah Calloway did not reach for his rifle only because he recognized the horse before he recognized the man. Chief Standing Elk sat tall against the white sky, his face carved from 20 years of sun and sorrow, and in his outstretched hand was a folded square of leather, cracked at every seam, bound with a cord that had gone the color of old bone. "Your grandfather's debt," Standing Elk said, "and nothing else." Jed took the leather bundle because refusing it felt like refusing something older than himself, and when he untied the cord his stomach dropped. The writing inside was not English. It curled and slanted in a hand trained decades before he was born, half of it Spanish, half of it something stranger still, and not one word of it made sense to a man who'd spent his whole life reading cattle brands instead of books. Jed's fingers traced the strange, looping letters twice, 3 times, hoping meaning might rise up out of stubbornness alone. It didn't. Whatever language this was, it belonged to a world his grandfather had never once mentioned in 20 years of quiet evenings on the porch, and that silence now felt less like privacy and more like something deliberately buried. "What debt?" Jed asked, but Standing Elk had already turned his horse. "Ask the drunk who used to wear the collar," the chief said over his shoulder, and then he was gone, swallowed by heat shimmer and distance, leaving Jed alone on land the bank had already marked for foreclosure, holding a letter that might be worth nothing, or might be the only thing standing between him and losing everything his grandfather had ever built. Jed stood in the yard long after the dust of Standing Elk's horse had settled, turning the strange bundle over in his hands the way a man turns over a stone he suspects might be hollow. His grandfather had never once spoken of any Apache chief, never once mentioned a debt, and yet the leather binding was old enough, worn enough, that it had clearly been waiting for this exact moment for far longer than Jed had been alive. Whatever it held, it had outlasted the man who caused it. The foreclosure notice was still nailed to his own front door, where the bank's man had left it 3 days before, a square of paper he could read perfectly well, every cruel word of it, in stark contrast to the one he couldn't. It struck him, standing there between the 2 documents, that his whole future had come down to a letter he understood and a letter he didn't, and only one of them still held any hope in it. He rode into town that same afternoon with the letter tucked inside his coat like it might burn a hole through the fabric if he let it sit still too long. Horace Bellamy, the banker who already had his eye on the Calloway spread's water rights, watched him pass from the porch of the mercantile and called out, loud enough for half the street to hear, that a man ought to sell his worthless dirt before it swallowed him whole. Jed didn't answer. He was thinking about one man in town who might read Latin letters and old Spanish scrawl, a man everybody else had long since stopped listening to. He'd only met Ezra Voss twice before in his life. Once at his own mother's burial, when the old man had still worn the collar and said the words over her grave with a steadiness Jed had never forgotten, and once outside the saloon, stepping over him without a second glance the way most of Dustland had learned to do. It struck him now, riding toward the livery stable, that the same man who'd once spoken the only kind words at his mother's grave might be the only man left who could speak for his grandfather too. Ezra Voss lived behind the livery stable in a room that smelled of whiskey and old paper, and most of Dustland had stopped calling him Father Voss the year he stopped wearing the collar. Once he had preached to soldiers and settlers alike, and before that, further back than anyone in town cared to remember, he had lived among the Apache for 6 years translating treaties nobody honored. Now he swept stalls for whiskey money and let children throw stones at his boots without flinching, because a man who has already lost everything learns there's nothing left to defend. Children in Dustland had a rhyme they sang whenever Ezra passed, something about a priest who prayed to a bottle now, and grown men who should have known better laughed along with them. Nobody remembered, or cared to, that he had once ridden 200 miles alone to negotiate a ceasefire between a cavalry patrol and a starving Apache hunting party, armed with nothing but a Bible and passable Spanish. The town had decided who he was and stopped looking any closer, the same way it had already decided what Jed's failing ranch was worth. Jed found him there, sitting on an overturned bucket with a bottle he hadn't opened yet, and when Jed held out the letter, Ezra's hand trembled before it even touched the paper. "Standing Elk gave you this," he said, not a question. Jed nodded, and Ezra's eyes, bloodshot and tired, went suddenly sharp, the way a man's eyes go sharp when a ghost he thought he'd buried walks back through the door. Ezra had gone quiet a long moment after taking the letter, running his thumb along the cracked leather like a man greeting an old friend he'd wronged. "I buried this life on purpose," he said. 6 years among the Apache, learning their tongue, their code, watching good men break every treaty I helped write down in good faith. I told myself I was done being useful to anybody after that. Easier to just be the drunk behind the stable. Nobody expects anything from a man like that. He said it without self-pity, the way a man states a fact about weather. Jed remembered his grandfather Silas most clearly, not through words, but through his hands, thick, scarred hands that had built the ranch fence post by post, that had once pressed a rusted door key into Jed's small palm and said the only sermon the boy ever needed: "A man's word buried in the ground is worth more than gold sitting in a bank." Jed hadn't understood it then. He'd been 8 years old and more interested in the barn cat. But the phrase had followed him through every hard winter since, the way certain sentences do when the people who say them are gone. "You're the first person in 4 years who's come to me for something besides swept-out stalls," Ezra said quietly, turning the letter over in his hands like it might crumble. "Why do you figure Standing Elk trusted you enough to hand this over instead of burning it?" Jed didn't have an answer, only the memory of his grandfather's hands and a phrase that had never made sense until this exact moment felt like it might finally start to. "Maybe he didn't trust me," Jed said. "Maybe he trusted whatever's written in there more than he trusts either of us." "Your grandfather ever tell you why he built this ranch so close to the old agency road, instead of further out where the grazing's better?" Ezra asked, almost to himself. Jed shook his head. He'd never once questioned it, the way a child never questions the shape of the only home he's known. "Man doesn't build that close to a road he's ashamed of," Ezra said. "He builds there because he wants to be found, if the day ever comes that someone comes looking." Jed felt something shift quietly in his chest, an old certainty about his grandfather rearranging itself into something both stranger and truer. He thought of every stranger who had ever ridden up that road over the years, drifters, agency men, the occasional lost traveler, and wondered now how many of them his grandfather had quietly watched, waiting. "Come back tomorrow," Ezra said finally, folding the letter with a care that surprised Jed, like a man handling something he'd once been afraid of touching again. "This isn't Spanish alone. Half of it's written in a mission code the priests used 40 years back, so no soldier could read a promise made to the wrong people. I'll need the night." Jed left him there with the bottle still unopened on the floor, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ezra Voss didn't reach for it either. Walking home in the dark, Jed passed the schoolhouse where children's slates sat stacked behind dusty glass, and found himself wondering what kind of teacher Ezra Voss might have made, in some other version of this town that hadn't already decided who he was. It was a strange thing to think about on a night when his own future hung on a stranger's translation, but hope, once it found a crack to slip through, tended to spread further than a man expected. Word travels faster than truth in a small town, and by the next morning half of Dustland knew the Calloway boy had gone begging help from the drunk behind the livery. Horace Bellamy made sure of it, dropping the story over every counter and card table he visited, adding each time that a fool chasing Apache riddles deserved to lose his land twice as fast. The foreclosure notice on Jed's door was dated for the second week of the month, and Bellamy had already told the county surveyor to expect new owners on the water rights well before then. At the general store an old rancher Jed had known his whole life wouldn't meet his eyes, muttering only that a smart man cuts his losses before pride finishes the job the bank started. Jed had heard some version of that sentence from half the town by sundown, always delivered kindly, always meant to help, and each time it landed like a stone dropped quietly into a well that was already running dry. Jed rode back to the ranch to find 2 of Bellamy's men already walking his fence line with a surveyor's chain, measuring ground that wasn't theirs yet like it already was. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for the shotgun leaning by the door, though his hand ached with wanting to. He simply stood at the gate and told them, quiet and even, that the land was still his until a judge said otherwise, and quiet dignity, his grandfather always said, carried further than a raised voice ever could. The surveyors reported back to Bellamy that evening, and by morning the banker himself rode out to the Callaway gate, dismounting slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he wants his patients noticed. "I could make this easy for you, or I could make it very hard," Bellamy said, resting one boot on the lowest rail. "The letter you're chasing is Apache superstition, boy. No court in this territory has ever ruled in favor of one over a bank's paper." Jed only looked at him and said that he'd rather lose to the truth than win by giving up on it, and Bellamy's smile thinned into something considerably less friendly before he rode away. Not every voice in town joined Bellamy's chorus. The blacksmith's wife, who'd lost a brother to the same fever winter Jed's grandfather had once ridden out into, pressed a warm loaf into Jed's hands outside the mercantile and told him, quiet enough that only he could hear, that some families remembered what silence cost, even when they couldn't say so out loud. It wasn't much. But it was the first kindness he'd been offered all week that didn't come wrapped in pity. That evening Ezra didn't come to the ranch. Jed went to him instead, and found the old man surrounded by scraps of paper covered in his own cramped translation, half a bottle gone but his hands steady as a surgeon's. "It's slow work," Ezra admitted, not looking up. "The mission code breaks a sentence into 3 pieces and scatters them. I have to hold all 3 in my head at once before it means anything. I haven't done this since I was a younger, better man." Jed noticed, for the first time, that Ezra's exhaustion looked less like defeat and more like effort, the specific tiredness of someone doing something that mattered again. "If I get this wrong," Ezra admitted, setting down his pencil, "if I mistranslate even one line, it could mean nothing in front of a judge, or worse, it could mean something false. I owe your grandfather better than a guess." It was the first time in years anyone in Dustland had heard Ezra Voss speak of owing anybody anything, rather than the other way around. In town the next day, Bellamy cornered Jed outside the assay office and offered him, in front of witnesses, a price for the ranch that was almost generous enough to be insulting, enough to leave town with dignity, not enough to ever come back and start again elsewhere. "Your grandfather's dirt isn't worth pride," Bellamy said, loud enough to carry. Jed folded his arms, and for the length of one long silence he said nothing at all, because Ezra had told him that morning that the letter wasn't finished, but it wasn't nothing either, and a man doesn't sell his last card before he's seen what's written on it. He rode home past the schoolhouse again that night, and this time there was a lamp burning behind the livery long past the hour the town usually went dark. He didn't stop. He only slowed his horse a moment, watching that small stubborn light, and let himself believe, for the length of one breath, that it might still be burning for him. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Jed lay awake staring at the same water-stained ceiling his grandfather had once stared at, turning Bellamy's thread over beside the memory of Standing Elk's unreadable face, and wondering whether he'd inherited a ranch worth saving or just a debt too old and too strange for any court to honor. The message came scrawled on a torn scrap of paper, carried by a stable boy who'd been paid a nickel to run it, and it said only 3 words, "Come now, understood." Jed rode into town before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, his heart going faster than the horse beneath him, because a man who has waited 3 days for an answer learns to read urgency into even the smallest handwriting. Ezra sent word before sunrise, "Come now." Jed found him at the stable with the full translation laid out across 3 sheets of borrowed paper, and the old man's hands were shaking again, but not from want of whiskey. "Your grandfather didn't just know Standing Elk's grandfather," Ezra said. "He saved his life. 19 years before you were born, during the fever winter, when the agency turned the Apache away from the ration house and half the band was starving, Silas Calloway broke the law and drove 3 wagons of grain out to their camp himself, at night, knowing what it would cost him if he was caught." Jed asked, quietly, why his grandfather had never once spoken of any of it, not the fever winter, not the wagons, not a single word across 20 years of evenings on that same porch. Ezra considered the question a long moment before answering. "Some men don't talk about the times they were brave," he said, "because bravery like that always comes wrapped in somebody else's suffering. Silas didn't want a story told about a winter when children nearly starved. He just wanted the wagons to arrive. It was, Jed thought, exactly the kind of answer his grandfather himself would have given. Standing Elk didn't ride out here on a whim either, Ezra added. His own people have argued for years about whether honoring an old promise to a white rancher's family was worth the risk of reopening old wounds with the agency. He carried this letter across land that isn't safe for him to cross, on the word of a grandfather 40 years dead, because a broken promise is the one thing his family has never allowed itself to become known for. Jed understood, hearing that he wasn't the only man risking everything on a piece of paper. The chief's grandfather wrote this letter as a promise, Ezra went on, sealed by a mission priest as witness, in the code so no agency man could use it as evidence against either family. It says that whatever Callaway land remains, whatever Callaway blood asks for it, the Apache people will stand as witness before any court, any bank, any government surveyor, that this ground was never abandoned, never worthless, and never for sale against the will of its rightful family. It's not sentiment, Jed. It's a legal witness testimony, older than Bellamy's bank, tied to the same water rights he's trying to steal. Jed sat down hard on the overturned bucket, the same one Ezra always used, and for a moment neither man spoke. He thought of his grandfather's hands pressing that rusted key into his palm, the sentence that made no sense to an 8-year-old boy. A man's word buried in the ground is worth more than gold sitting in a bank. He understood it now, completely, the way you only understand certain things once they've cost someone everything to prove true. And beneath the relief sat something heavier, a flicker of shame that he'd almost taken Bellamy's offer 2 days before, almost sold the ground his grandfather bled for without ever knowing what it had truly cost to keep it. He said as much out loud, quietly, and Ezra only nodded, because a man confessing his near mistakes to another man who has made plenty of his own is not something that needs forgiving out loud. Standing Elk arrived at the stable door not long after, having ridden through the night once word reached his camp that the translation was finished, and for a long moment the three men simply stood together in silence, Cowboy, chief, and fallen priest, bound by a debt none of them had asked for but all of them now shared. My grandfather waited 40 years to be believed, Standing Elk said at last. I did not want to wait a 5th decade to see it finished. Jed asked the only question that mattered. Will you stand with me, Jed asked, in front of the judge, and read this out loud? Ezra looked at the collar in the box he still hadn't thrown away, and for the first time in years, he reached for it instead of the bottle. Before Jed left the stable that morning, Standing Elk pressed something else into his hand, a small carved token, worn smooth by decades of handling, that had belonged to the same grandfather who had written the letter. So the judge sees this promise was never only paper, Standing Elk said. Some things a family keeps precisely because they fear the world will forget them otherwise. Jed closed his fist around it, understanding finally that he wasn't the only man who had spent a lifetime carrying something he didn't fully understand. The circuit judge held session in the schoolhouse 2 days later, and the whole town came to watch Bellamy lose for the first time anyone could remember. Ezra Voss stood before the bench in a borrowed collar and read the translated letter aloud in a clear, steady voice that hadn't cracked like that in a decade, while Chief Standing Elk sat in the front row as living witness that the promise was no forgery. The judge ruled the water rights bound to the letter's terms, the foreclosure void, and Bellamy surveyor stakes pulled from ground that had never stopped being Callaway land. Standing Elk did not smile as the ruling was read, but he inclined his head once toward Jed, the smallest gesture, and it carried more weight than anything Bellamy had shouted in that room all morning. The same townsfolk who'd avoided Jed's eyes at the general store now lingered afterward to shake his hand, the way people always find their courage once the outcome is no longer in doubt. By the following spring, the Callaway fence line had been mended post by post, the well ran clean, and Ezra Voss had traded the room behind the livery for a small schoolhouse office, teaching reading to any child in Dustland whose family could spare an hour, collar back on, bottle finally empty in a way that meant something. Jed kept the old leather-wrapped letter in a small cedar box on the mantel, not locked away, but displayed, the way you keep something too important to hide. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Jed would take the letter down just to hold it, remembering his grandfather's hands, the rusted key, the sentence that had taken him 20 years and one Apache chief's ride across the desert to finally understand. Gold sits in a bank and waits to be spent. A man's word, buried deep enough and kept faithfully enough, waits instead to be honored, and when it finally is, it outlasts every fortune built against it. If you were in Jed's shoes, would you have trusted a stranger's word, and a rival's silence, with everything you had left?